Hi, we've got a very good panel here. So I'll start calling them in the same order that's there in the little booklet that you might already have. So first I'll start with Clark. He's an analyst with Moonshot. That's a private company for profit. But they deal with a lot of data, and they keep studying data to understand what kind of, they use a proprietary technology to look at data and figure out what kind of trends are going on and use that for building counter-narratives. Dr. Anantha, he's director, UNESCO, Mahatma Gandhi Institute for Education and Peace. It's a new organization. They're still looking for land, so if you have some land to offer, they'll be very happy to build something on it. And they're working with the Ministry of HRD to try and build narratives in all kinds of issues. Mahima is heading public policy for Twitter. She's also the chair for Sci-Fi, one of the best conferences that she helped found along with Samir. And she's been looking at some of these issues for a long time, so she's a valuable addition to this panel. And we have Kavita. Kavita's from Facebook. And Kavita is stepping in for Anki, who couldn't make it because of a personal issue. But Kavita is a lawyer. She's from one of the best law schools in the country, ILS Pune. And she's also done a program in international relations from SOAS. And she has been personally working on some of the CEV issues. So we couldn't find a better person to address some of these issues here. And if you have any tough questions for Facebook, I'm always available to help you out with them. So what we'll do is we have about 1 hour, 15 minutes for us. So I'd like to keep at least 20 minutes for questions and answers right at the end. So we'll ask our panelists to start some quick introductory remarks. Then we'll have some themes that we'll try and look through. And the last part will be for questions, so that if anybody has any questions, suggestions, comments, etc., please throw them at us, and we would love to collect all of that. So let's start with Mahima, if you would like to address some of these issues.
So thank you so much, Saikat, and thank you, ORF, for hosting this valuable discussion. And thanks for inviting Twitter. So what I thought I would do is I'll just kickstart by giving a broad overview of terrorist activity on social media, especially Twitter, and what we've been seeing and the work that we've done so far. And I think that'll sort of segue into some of the work that my fellow panelists will talk about regarding actually developing counter-narratives and alternative narratives. So Twitter has actually been at the forefront of fighting online terrorism when it comes to social media companies. If you look back at 2015, which is about 3 years ago, but feels like almost 30 years ago, we had an issue with a lot of ISIS-related, terrorist-related accounts on the platform, and there were regular media stories that talked about Twitter has a big problem. And in the last 3 years, we've taken a number of steps to make sure that we have been able to reverse that story and reverse that trend to a very large degree. So, since 2015, about, I think, 1.1 million terrorist-related accounts have been removed from the platform. And if you look at what's happening today, in fact, the overwhelming number of accounts that are removed, I think it's almost 97 or so, I'm not good at numbers, is actually removed by our own proprietary technologies, which are spam-fighting technologies and a couple of other algorithms that I can't get into the details of. And many, actually, I think the majority of those accounts are actually removed from the platform before they even make their first tweet. So this story has actually, there has been an improvement in the way that these groups have been using our platform. Having said that, there are other things that we should kind of consider when we're talking about, developing conversations on social media. It's not very long ago that we lived in a world without social media. I think Facebook might be 13 years old, if I'm not mistaken, and we're about 12 years old. And if you looked at the structure of media before that, it was, if you think of it like a pyramid, media was generated right at the top, and it was disseminated to everybody around the world. And the sources that you got media from were, they were controlled sources. That story, of course, has changed because people are producing content, in villages, in towns, in cities, from wherever you might think. And we're getting a multiplicity of voices, actually. And we're able to hear first, people's own accounts of what happened. And I think the scale and the speed at which we're getting so much information, I don't think any other generation has really had to process it the way we are having to process it. So it has, of course, its positives and it has its negatives. So as much as technology sometimes is seen as the problem, and technology is also sometimes seen as the solution, I think the answer kind of lies in the middle. Technology is part of a broader landscape. But coming back to technology, there are a couple of ways a company can look at the problem. So one of them I told you is looking at what we can do ourselves in terms of the policies that we have, and you have to measure that are our policies enough. The problem, when the policies were made, say it was made a couple of years ago, are they still valid today given the trends and how the problems change? So we have, of course, updated our policies to make sure that we are able to take extremist content off the platform, not just content that promotes terrorism. We've looked at our rules, and when Twitter started, it was block and mute. But we looked at our tools, and the tools have, of course, expanded since then. So you can do a lot more on Twitter in terms of keeping your account safe and not engaging with the content that you don't want to engage with. But again, these tools are there for a variety of people, because not everybody wants to be shielded from all kinds of content. There will be a lot of people who will want to actually know what's going on, and I think some of the researchers here will certainly be part of that group. And the third and the last bit before I finish is really the users, because ultimately, Twitter is a platform. But how are people using it? What happens when a big incident occurs? What happens when there's a terrorist incident? What is the kind of conversations that take place? What's the kind of counter-narrative that happens? And we can look at that from 3 buckets. One is organized, because there will be groups that actually do this work, and they are very structured in their manner. The second is a natural outpouring that happens. So when you have a refugee crisis, you have a hashtag saying refugee welcome, right? And when you have a shooting in Australia and you have anti-Muslim sentiment, you suddenly have a campaign called I'll Ride With You, which tells people don't feel scared to ride public transport alone, especially if you're wearing a hijab, I will sit with you. And so you have a number of these outpourings on social media which are just organic, and it's not necessarily people who are affected by the incident, but they're people who want to participate. And then when they engage in this kind of content, it helps reach places and people who might need to see that, to actually feel like they are part of a wider community. So yeah, so I'll end there, but really we look at it from a product point of view, we look at our policies, and then we look at our users and how we can engage with our users to surface more positive content.
You had some very interesting ideas to start with. If you could, Mike. So you had some very interesting ideas, and I thought you wanted to shock a few people in the audience. So if you want to make that a part of your opening remarks.
So let me start off with sort of speculating a situation. Imagine if we had Facebook and Twitter during the time when India was fighting for its independence. And you would have had Gandhi, or by one group as defined as a terrorist, and as a freedom fighter by a different group. And you would have had 2 narratives based on, from 2 different perspectives. And both might would have had their reasons for. So the challenge here is how do we provide a space where we can have a dialogue? I want to emphasize the word dialogue here a number of times. And it's not about us against them. So if you have a narrative, you want to do a counter-narrative, and then it breaks into a game of us against them. You might get into the tyranny of the majority in many cases, or even sometimes the minority tends to dominate. So the challenge is how not to just ban it, because the human reaction is if you ban something, you want to actually fight against the ban. And what science shows is that this resistance is at the highest during the adolescent period. Neurobiologically, many of the chemical reactions that go in our brains seem to be really happening at this time, where the emotion basically is the one that drives. Rationality is gone out of the windows. Many call it the amygdala hijack. That's where the emotions are. So it's setting up a space and where we allow the dialogue, allow the process of deconstructing the message, rather than just countering with another narrative, is to actually have an inquiry. a critical inquiry approach. Break down the narrative and then reconstruct it, and using the various information that's available. Some of them might be contradicting, because now we don't have, the problem is not about a lack of information, now we have too much information. So these are competencies that we don't provide to ourselves as well as to the younger generation. These are not taught in school. And this is where these competencies, what they call the 21st century competencies, are extremely critical. And UNESCO has been pushing that under this new Education 2030 agenda. Now, but I want to go a little bit deeper in a sense of what some of the work that we do at the Institute is that we even think for those competencies you need something a little bit more fundamental. Because to have a dialogue, you need to understand first the emotions that go through you. It's not to control it. It's not about controlling the emotions, but it's to understand those emotions. If I'm angry, to understand that I am angry, and to understand why you're angry and what's triggering it. That's difficult. And that comes through a lot of the new research in the neurosciences on mindfulness exercises and stuff, and they are starting these at schools in many countries. Then the next one is about, it's about yourself. You can't really have a dialogue until you understand yourself. Then the next one, which is the most difficult one, which we hardly see happening these days, is the empathy. So it is about understanding the other. I always was amazed, well, I shouldn't use the word amazed because that becomes quite academic. Concerned why a young person would blow themselves up and want to kill so many others when they are at the prime of their life. They must have been pushed to the hilt. We need to understand that, rather than just shutting them down. And it's not easy. And it's the same thing with the Gandhi question, to put yourself in that perspective. So I think we need to start answering that just rather than getting into, I hate to use this cliche of Gandhi, an eye for an eye leaves the world blind. That's where we are leading ourselves to. The immediate knee-jerk reaction is use force, because it sends all these chemicals of good feeling into the brains, and sort of you get that emotion because that's how you want to feel. And we need to have some control over that. And then the third part, which we also use here, is about the compassion part. What do you do about it? And surprisingly, when you have an exercise of mindfulness, empathy, and compassion, you can still have a suicide bomber. And so this is why you need that critical inquiry, always questioning. We had an experience with a young man that we brought in a workshop who was part of in the Kashmir conflict, and how he had gone and become an extremist, and then he came. And the thing that really got him thinking about is once he started reading the Quran for what it was. And he really went and did a critical inquiry of what it was saying and what was being said on the media. So that's about deconstructing the message which has been put up on the platforms, and then reconstructing it. And once he reconstructed it, he feels, hey, hang on, this is not what I stand for, and then he comes out. So these are the voices that we have to celebrate. These are the voices that we have to engage in this discussion. So let me conclude by sort of having maybe three key messages. One is dialogue is very important, but dialogue in a way that not by countering, but to actually have an exchange, understanding, respect, not already naming, branding each one of the other. Build the competencies. I think that's where it is. But unfortunately, a lot of times I lose most of the policymakers when I say this is about a 2 to 3 generation program. And in economics, when we do modeling, a generation is 25 years. That's a long trip. But I think there are no quick fixes, because we are dealing with the mind, and it's about changing mindsets. And not about just the extremists, it's about all of us. I think that's very important. Because a lot of times we just go into the region. But we need to have a dialogue between all countries, young people from all the countries. And then the third one, which I hope we'll have some discussions, is about safe legal frameworks to allow these dialogues to occur. I am afraid to do any search on the internet, anything related with jihadism, extremism, and then once they look at a picture of myself, that's it, I'm dead. Just look at this, all right? So, I need that safe space. And it was interesting, I just went through Frankfurt, and I went through the whole screen, nothing beeped, and I got still pulled out. But the young man, and we joked about it, he sort of said, you had this look, you had tattoos, we had to pull you out. And it was like, hey, you're profiling me. Because the system didn't, everything cleared. And then he said, I'm not a racist. And I said, I believe you're not a racist. Of course you're not a racist, but you profiled, it was an automatic reaction. And so this requires a lot of dialogue and understanding. And I'll finish off by saying tolerance is not enough. Tolerance is not acceptable. It's about understanding and respect. Because just to tolerate another I don't think we have gone past that. Thank you.
So compassion, empathy, and mindfulness. These are the three major takeaways. Kavita, I think 2 billion people are now on the platform. So that's a huge population. How do you tackle this?
First of all, I'd like to begin by thanking ORF for hosting this conference and bringing so many experts in the room. Facebook runs quite a few programs around the topic of CVE. We have a global program called Global Peer-to-Peer Challenge, which is on extremism, where you have student teams who run campaigns for about a semester, roughly about 5 to 6 months. We've been running this program since 2014 to 15. In 2016, in fact, there was a foundation, Lal Unar Foundation from Afghanistan that had participated, and they won this challenge, a counter-speech campaign that they'd built. In 2017, there was a team from University of Dhaka that had participated and had also won this challenge. That's at the global level. From the global level, we decided that we needed to bring in more local context, and so we decided to run what is called Voice Positive. Some of you may have heard about it because ORF was our collaborative partner over here in India. Voice Positive is very similar to the peer-to-peer challenge, where again, you had student-led teams who ran campaigns, CVE campaigns, understood the topic first. We conducted 2 regional workshops. They understood what extremism was. They understood who their target audience was going to be, how to take this message out to them. Does it help to talk about CVE, that is extremism, and using those terms as such? What other topics they should cover? And then they went out to people who are online and offline. So those were the campaigns that we ran. Later today in the evening, there's going to be a finale, and some of the campaigns are going to talk about how the campaigns were and whether they were successful or not. Another program that we ran last year was called Digital Masala Challenge, which was being run by Youth Ki Awaaz. It's a little different from the student-led campaigns. In Youth Ki Awaaz, in Digital Masala Challenge, we had, over 2 days, we had a number of teams who came in. We had people who were from the financial background, from the law background, from the creative background who came in, who ideated over 2 days, and then at the end of the second day, there was a jury panel that decided that these were the best ideas. The best ideas were then given a $5,000 grant, and now they're in the execution period of those ideas. So the purpose behind doing all of these CVE programs is to have as many alternative and counter narratives out there. So to what Anantha was saying is that not only do we have to go into alternative narratives and counter narratives, but we also have to do critical inquiry. I couldn't agree more that we have to deconstruct that message. But I think we can do this simultaneously, where we look at how to deconstruct that message, figure out what the root causes of extremism are, and then also run campaigns, counter-narratives based on what that local context is.
Which didn't answer my question, but we'll come back to that. Clark.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, let me just say thanks so much to the ORF for inviting me and having me on this panel, and thanks to all of you for sticking it out this far. It's not easy to take in as much information as we've been presented with over the last couple of days. I'm going to do this slightly differently because we at Moonshot sit in a slightly different place versus the other panelists, in that we, of course, run CVE campaigns, but our value, the work that we spend our 9 till 6 every day doing, is in mostly gathering data and learning as much as we possibly can about the audience to whom those the CVE campaigns are directed. We're a data-driven CVE company, spend most of our time exploiting opportunities in the online space to counter violent extremism. And largely that means using or misusing online advertising technology to reach people who we know are searching for violent extremist material and offer them as credible as possible, an alternative message. To bring that to life a bit, what I thought I would do is just list some of the things, not how we work, but some of the things that we have discovered through our work, all of which I'll tie back together at the end, but they're going to sound unrelated. It is a list of findings, but I want to see if I can just provoke some people. Okay, so here's the list. These are things we discovered over the last few years. In Malaysia, interest in violent extremism among women is within a few percentage points the same as men. That was something we picked up after a project we did this year. Over in the United States, people positively engaging with content related to the violent far right also have higher than average levels of interest in Grand Theft Auto, the video game, Pokemon, Rihanna, sock puppets. I'm not kidding. And I will come back to why this is important. The same audience, the American violent far right, they're also 115% more likely to click on an advert offering them mental health support than the equivalent at-risk jihadist audience. Both of those audiences, people expressing interest and engagement with jihadism and the violent far right in America, both of them are significantly more likely than a control group, than your average internet user, to click on adverts offering mental health support. Similarly, that same violent far right audience, a lot of them are also looking for love on the internet, which is in itself perhaps not that surprising. And also, fine, nothing wrong with a bit of online dating. But after the events in Charlottesville in August last year, a lot of mainstream dating websites kicked them off, or at least kicked off those who were publicly saying they were sympathetic to white supremacist and neo-Nazi groups. The unintended consequence of this was that a lot of them coalesced around a dating website specifically for people who share those sympathies, which gave us an extraordinary data set, because it meant that suddenly we were able to see the average height and weight, the ordinary personality type, or the most common personality type. We know that they prefer dogs as pets. And this is all hugely valuable information. Away from the violent far right in America, we also already know, we know that Twitter have been hugely successful, because it used to be a very rich data source for us, but they've been hugely successful in moving people off their platform. A lot of them then went to Telegram, because Telegram as a messaging app is notoriously difficult to infiltrate. We have infiltrated it, only to largely find a huge amount of valuable information, but also that they're already moving off that. Google Plus was also a very interesting source of information. Jihadists, we infiltrated a jihadist group on Google Plus and posted some counter-narrative content just to see what would happen. And the really interesting thing is that nothing seemed to be happening, but because the link we used, which was redirecting them to a safe playlist that we had curated, that link was trackable. And when we looked at it, 95% of all the traffic to that link did not come from Google+. And the only real conclusion we could draw from that was that everybody in the group, well, lots of people in the group who saw the link, did want to click it, but they didn't want to be seen to be clicking it in that social context. So they copied and pasted it, they sent it to a friend, they found another way of accessing, because they wanted to see what it said, but they didn't want their jihadist peers to see that they were interested in that. We also see this trend time and again across almost all our projects, that jihadist content on YouTube is not a walled garden. It's not the case that people spend hours and hours and hours watching jihadist videos. They, like the rest of us, have decreasingly short attention spans, and they're actually way more likely to watch Despacito, then a beheading video, and then a fashion blog video. It's way more likely that they'll do that. Which is interesting when it comes to counter-narratives. And then lastly, the last example of something much more recent, Bashar al-Assad gave a speech on the 31st of May in which he threatened to use violence against US troops if they wouldn't leave Syria. Online in France, in the following days, we had a 5,300% spike in searches related to how to join ISIS. So those are some little highlights of things that we discovered. And the point about listing them and the point about the variation is that every single one of them is important to us because it helps us understand our audience, and it helps us understand at a really, really deep level how to reach people and how to ultimately have the best shot at changing their minds.
Thanks, that's very, very insightful. Just to contextualize this conversation, I have friends in all the wrong places whose job is to keep hunting for people with extremist ideologies. So I have a lot of conversations with them. One statistic I'll throw at you. Between 2005, I mean, India has had a long history of extremists as well as dealing with, I'm using these labels a little loosely, terrorism or extremist ideologies, right from the 50s in the Northeast to 1990 in Kashmir and so on and so forth. And you have Sushant Sareen here who's done a lot of work on this if you want to follow his work on this. But what's interesting is if you were to look at one minority community in this country, which is the largest minority community, the number of people, guess the number of people who signed up for a global jihad cause between 2005 and 2013. Any guesses from the audience? The number of people who signed up? Any numbers? If you want to take a guess. 150, anybody else? 10, anybody else? So the number of people who signed up for a global jihadi cause between this period was 1. That's it. And this speaks volumes about this country, the community, and democracy, and so on and so forth. Just 1. And guess what the story is? The person went to Pakistan. There they tried to turn him into saying that, look, don't go for these global causes. There's a lot of problems here in South Asia. Why don't you do what we are anyway helping support do, the Kashmir cause and all. The person refused to do that, tried to go abroad, became very depressed, and I think around 2013, went back to his hometown in Hyderabad and committed suicide. He was so disillusioned with whatever had happened to him. All that changed when the ISIS came up. And suddenly you have these 20 from Kerala, from Tamil Nadu, and even states we had not even heard of, and coming from socioeconomic backgrounds which we had never heard of, suddenly coming into this. So those are some of the contextualizations that we need to look at, and some of these questions I'll direct at my panelists based on some of this data. Because I've also, part of my work is to keep looking at interrogation reports and understand what they're saying, something what Clark and what Anantha spoke about, that how do we understand some of these mindsets and the triggers that lead to this. So what I heard from you, Mahima, was that we are very quick at identifying these ideologies, and we remove them, and some of them, as you said, even before a single tweet has gone out, we are able to remove them. But isn't that somehow lobbying the problem to somebody else? Because the whole idea, as Anand has brought out so beautifully, you should look at conversations and you should create a safe space for conversations, because that actually gives you a lot of indicators. If your primary tactic is to get people off the platform, you're just sending them into encrypted channels, which becomes far difficult, and they are now much more radicalized to deal with this. So why and how should this getting them off the platform tactic really work?
Firstly, you're right, but let me just clarify. We don't identify them based on ideology. We look at behavior. So it doesn't have to do with content, but really like clusters of accounts where they originate from, and it kind of works the same way spam works. Because what happened with ISIS was that they would have, tons of accounts, hundreds of thousands of accounts there to amplify a particular message or a particular tweet. So we were able to look at like the behaviors, and it's the same thing that we do for spam across the world. So we're not like looking at it from a content point of view. People have suggested that you look at it from a keyword point of view, but of course that's not possible, because it's not just people looking to join ISIS who would be tweeting or searching for ISIS, for example, it would be journalists and it would be ordinary people maybe curious to read about it. Now, having said that, yes, there was a lot of pressure on the companies. I think Facebook can also speak to that, about the fact that this content even existed and the fact that we were not doing enough to remove this content. And we, of course, had policies that did not allow people to promote terrorism or incite terrorism, etc. And ultimately what happened is that the companies buckled down and became very good at removing this content. As you mentioned, it created a second problem, which is that this content then ended up moving to smaller companies, right? And those companies are not at the same level as a Facebook or the same level as a Twitter or any other. So there is now a group which has been formed, which is it's a global coalition on counterterrorism. And 50 smaller companies have been signed up who actually get assistance from the larger companies in terms of how we actually tackle the content on our platform. We also have a hash, a database that we share. So I think over 40,000 hashes, which has to do with images and videos, which are identified content when it comes to extremist ideology and terrorism, which then are shared and they are then taken off the internet. So that's on the removal side. On the side, the question that you're asking me, should it be a safe space? Absolutely. I mean, I think the core of what Twitter is that it's an open platform, and it's a platform where different kinds of people talk to each other and talk at each other. And what we have tried to maintain as a platform is that, yes, there are policies and there are certain red lines. If you cross those, we will remove that content from the platform. But if you're within the policies of Twitter, you should be able to say what you want. And those who don't want to engage with your content can remove themselves from the conversation. But those who actually want to engage can engage. And I think that results in an everyday, sort of a very, very emotional and a very active,
so
platform.
In a way, you're in a slightly difficult boat, because on one hand, you have to maintain a safe space,
Yeah.
but it also means you'll have to censor some kind of content because you have decided that this is promoting terrorism or extremist. So how do you achieve this balance between, having less censorship and yet having to block some kinds of content?
It is a difficult balance to reach, and I think every company has to firstly strive. We have entire teams of experts who actually draft the policies, because the policies are global and every word matters in terms of what you put in your policy. And then we have teams of experts who can actually weigh content once they get user reports against those policies. And it can be subjective many times, where you are looking at content that somebody might have reported, but you realize that this is a person just talking about the issue and not a direct promotion and incitement, and we let the content stay on. And I'm sure you've noticed that people have objections, and that is the way it goes. Sometimes people joke that if you're making no one happy, perhaps you're doing something right. So it is a tough spot to be in, but yeah, we do have policies, and there's certain content we don't want on the platform. So
has Twitter as a company ever thought about engaging these people?
So, see, we are a platform and we are not the experts when it comes to counterterrorism and, sort of de-radicalizing people. And I think that we recognize that. What we do is we notice the behavior of different kinds of people on the platform. So we know which groups are using Twitter to actually do a lot of positive, sort of engagement. We know individuals. I mean, for example, you were talking about ISIS and dating and, those kind of things. There were ISIS fighters who had Twitter accounts. They actually were getting into fights with each other. There was one which was widely covered by the press, where two of them got into a fight about a girl. I mean, there were some very interesting accounts. Then there were people who were actually, who had kind of escaped from these areas, and they were talking about it. So what we do as a company is that we are able to engage with organizations who work on these issues, and we're able to tell them this is how to use Twitter in the best way that you can. I think some of these organizations already are far ahead of them. We also engage with law enforcement for that matter, and we try and get them up to speed that this is our platform, these are the products, this is what actually works on Twitter, this is not what works on Twitter. But when it comes to the messaging, I don't think that we are the people to do the messaging. We have to basically make sure our house is safe, and I think it's going to be other people who will look into the messaging, and I think we're quite clear about that, yeah.
Thanks. Anand, you made some very interesting points about engaging people, about using compassion, empathy, and I mean, that's an excellent approach, and a lot of people have proved that this works. But when you're looking at scale, and you're looking at scale, and the bigger the country is, the bigger the problem. And if you look at what's happening globally, here is suddenly an organization which has weaponized social media. I mean, if you look at the history of the ISIS came out of an extreme ideology which even had fights with the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, before they evolved into what is called the ISIS. And they immediately spotted social media as a way to grow and spread their message, which even the Al-Qaeda had not been able to figure out. So when you're looking at this, where people are already at a certain stage where they're pretty extreme, they're also looking at weaponizing this extremity and amplifying it through social media, etc. How do you address this question of scale and this extreme radicalization?
So you told me at the very beginning before that if it's a curved ball that is thrown at you, you just sort of duck it. Well, that's a really tough question. You know, I think the immediate response is there are no quick fixes. So I had an interesting question for you, is that if ISIS came as an organization to Twitter and say, we want to engage, it would be interesting to see what the reaction is. And my take would be to allow that exchange. It would be interesting to understand what the dialogue would emerge. One of the things I had as the discussion was going on is that, you know, what are the drivers? And we have had tons and tons of literature coming out from both individual academics as well as organizations of indirect drivers and direct drivers and stuff. Something that struck me is that it's primarily individuals going against a system. And it seems that they've lost, they just don't know how to engage with the system, a system which is so well entrenched. And then when they lose hope, and when they don't see any impact, then they get into a situation of hopelessness, and then they turn to these extremist views and stuff. Of course, it's much more complex in terms of the literature talks about a lack of identity, a lack of belonging, and I think that belonging, again, relates to this discontent with systems. So how do we allow that discontent to be heard and given respect? Even if we, you know, who defines it as an extremist view? And this is where we get into the free speech.
The first reaction usually is outrage instead of engagement.
Yeah. And you know, many people thought, I could come back to my favorite icon, Gandhi, not because, you know, I have to do it because he's the name of the institute, but he was defined as an extremist in the early days by the British for his views and stuff. And then now he's looked upon as one of the greatest sages of the century. So I think the dialogue is an important dimension. I think many of these people would like to have a space to have their views heard, to have a discussion with the system which is so well entrenched. I also say that many of us, and this is my favorite, I have to say it in every gathering that we have here, that our training is an extremely predatorial training. And I say the best predator training system that we have in the world is our schools, our education system. It trains us right from the start in a very Machiavellian mindset. Rewards are given in a sense of how well you do against the other, rather than rewards are given on how well you help the other. So it's a different chain of mindsets, and so we get caught into this trap. How do we change that? I don't know. It's a long process, and it's going to take a long time. Education systems will have to be reformed quite a bit, bring in a lot more compassion into the system, a little bit more patience with others, and with an understanding that everybody has a story. And when you listen to the story, you start to understand, if you give time and you're open enough to listen to that story. And I remember once, I'll just finish off that, there was a movie series, I don't know it just stopped. I don't know why. It was called The Tyrant.
Yes.
I was like, this is like real life being played out on that. The same dynamics, how somebody who was an American, well, he was from the Middle, but in the US, and then he goes and tries to do well, and then eventually he finds himself in the same behavior as his brother and his father who were tyrants. And it's interesting to sort of have those kind of narratives, and we were thinking actually we should use this for our school program. Because they had issues on gay aspects, gender. All the issues were in that particular series.
Kavita, I have 2 questions for you. The second question will depend on the answer to the first question. So you mentioned that you're doing these CVE programs. There is a global program which you have replicated in India. And then you've done another program, and you go from school to school or colleges and basically target the youth. But how do you decide and how do you measure the efficacy of these programs? What is the mechanism? That's what we want to understand.
Let's hope I give a good first answer so that the second question is not very hard. To just dial back a little before I answer your question, to what Mahima was talking about, I think that was a great question, which is when a lot of the large companies get really, really good at pushing out extremist content, pushing off extremist content and terrorist content from the platform, then where does it go and what do you do after that? Even last year when we talk about this is the rate at which we're able to take down terrorist content off Facebook. Today we can say that about 99% of all the ISIS and Al-Qaeda and affiliates content is taken down even before they're reported. And that's how good we've gotten at it. But sometime last year, all the companies came together, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Microsoft, formed what is called Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. And there's also another entity called Tech Against Terrorism. The idea was that even if you have other companies like a LinkedIn or a Just Paste It or any of the smaller companies which does not have the resources, let's say AI or machine learning, or generally just a database of what kind of extremist organizations and terrorist organizations function online, all of them can come together and you can share these resources and you can also share the knowledge on how to take down this content. So that is really important. And I think we need to build that as much as possible and try and bring in as many Indian entities into it as well. That's one. To answer your question, how do you look at the efficacy of these programs? Well, for the P2P challenge, we did look at some research last year. But I would go into Voice Positive and Digital Masala Challenge, which we have done in India. These are pilot programs. Now, the idea is to take the learnings and experiences of these pilot programs, understand what works in India, whether these campaigns are in fact useful. One of the things that we've done is we had commissioned research last year, which Maya is quite well aware of because she's the one who wrote the report, around hate speech and extremist speech on the platform. Understanding what works when you talk about counter-narratives. Like, for example, there was a Demos report which said that humor works best. There was Maya's report which said that if you can bring up these counter-narratives and alternative narratives at the time when an event happens, then it is most efficient. I think looking at that research and then plugging it into these programs is very useful. And also using that research, deconstructing that message, and then telling people who are running these campaigns that this is what is most effective, that is essentially how it should be done. So once you have run these pilot programs, I think it becomes easier to then decide that this is what we need to look into next.
Like, for example, you just said 99% we are able to take off even before it gathers any steam. But where is that figure coming from? Who's measuring it for you, or who's authenticating that figure for you?
So that
or is it all self? I mean, it's beginning to sound a little self-congratulatory that, you know, we are able to do 99.9%. I mean, nobody says, oh, we did about 68.3% and we still have so much to do. So who's stamping this measurement for you?
So internally, we have to make these assessments. First
of all, you yourself?
Yes, we did make these assessments.
You don't have any external people validating this?
Not yet. So we did make these assessments internally, and then we know that this is the kind of content that is there on the platform, that this is what we need to take down. This is the kind of content that is reported to us, and this is what has been taken down. It is based on that assessment. But other than for that, I'd also say that we have over 200 counterterrorism specialists working in Facebook alone. And counterterrorism specialists coming from the law enforcement background, coming from the engineering background, coming from an IR background like myself. So it's a very, very strong and good mix of 200 specialists that are working in the company. And it's based on that that we have decided that we do have some metal to make this internal assessment.
I'm still trying to understand how you validate this, because it's still a self-assessment. But my second question is, it's been a tough year for Facebook.
Oh, that wasn't the second question.
No, so the second question is, it's been a tough year for Facebook. I mean, there's been a lot of credibility issues, people signing off the platform, etc. So in an environment like this, how do you ensure that when you're engaging with someone, how do you build your credibility as an interlocutor when you're dealing with people like this? So what element do you bring in to make yourself more credible, especially when you've gone through so much of adverse publicity where your founder has been pulled up globally in front of so many parliaments and so on and so forth? How do you build that credibility to be a valid interlocutor? Because credibility is very important when you're engaging with people who are already agitated. So what do you do?
First of all, I think what's most important for us at this point is to communicate to users. And that is something that we have reiterated in the past several months, that we want to communicate to our users about what we're doing now and how we're fixing things. But I'll also go back to what Mahima had said earlier, which is that, I mean, just generally speaking, I don't want to use the term interlocutor because that is not the right term to be using over here. We are not the ones who are creating these messages. There is a community that can come together, a collective effort that you can rally around in order to ensure that your counter-narratives are effective. I don't know if it would be effective for us to put ourselves there as interlocutor and to use that as the terminology over here.
Clark, you've heard your co-panelists. I'll take you a little above. I mean, your insights were very, very useful. But we are currently looking at a globe which is fairly radicalized on all sides. You know, we've seen the American elections extremely polarized. In India, we see a lot of polarized debates. People speak, as Mahima pointed out, at each other rather than with each other, etc. So in a situation like this, how do you see, you know, everybody is an extremist to an extent. It just depends on what is the violence of that extremism that they are espousing. So where do you see all this going? I mean, do you think we are able to round the curve, or we are just looking at a much bigger problem and we are scratching around cluelessly? What's your take?
I'll have a go at that, and you can tell me how close I get. I mean, I wanted to talk about takedowns of content anyway, because it's come up. It's a difficult one for us because, of course, the content being there gives us some stuff to analyze, and that's extremely important and incredibly valuable. But of course, lots of it shouldn't be there, so we have to kind of grudgingly accept that these guys have got really good at removing it. And taking down content is obviously essential if it's illegal and if it's just unequivocally breaching terms of service and breaching the law. One of the issues is that that leaves a huge amount of content that's neither of those things, but still has the power to incite. And this is the problem with the extremist continuum, right? Is where is the line? Our proposed solution, if that's the right word, is let the platforms take down the content that they unequivocally know should be taken down. And in the meantime, it's incumbent upon us as civil society actors to be there when people engage with, publish, deal with, and interact in any way with that other content, the blurry content that's still dangerous. And by be there, one way of doing it is by being there as an advert, as it were, to offer them an alternative, not to hector them, not to say, you shouldn't have liked that, you shouldn't be searching for this, you shouldn't be engaging with it. But don't do any of that, but instead just say, look, here, there is an alternative to this. And not only is it an alternative, but it's semi-bespoke because it's related to what you're looking at and what you're talking about and the other online behaviors that you're exhibiting. How close does that get as an answer to your question?
Pretty much. So let me just ask an additional question. For example, Europe has dealt with this problem, especially with the violence in Syria, how many people to let in and how many people to keep out. But some countries like Belgium have also experienced that when you have too many people coming in, a lot of radical ideologies start festering because of structural and sociological inequities. How do you deal with some of these issues when you're in the government? For example, the Charlie Hebdo attacks. At one hand, you have the right to provoke and have free speech, but that led to such a violent reaction. And it just sharpens the edges. So how do you deal with these contradictory perspectives?
Well, one way is to relentlessly pursue the truth rather than people's performative opinions. And the only way you can really do that is through data, as opposed to surveys or interviews. One good example of this is the difference between performative social media behavior and what people actually type into a search engine, right? So everybody's got that friend on social media, or at least, well, probably significantly more than one, who regularly overshares, and you think, what on earth are you doing publishing this much stuff about you and saying these things about yourself? But in spite of that, there is still an enormous gulf between what people are happy to put on their Instagram and what they actually look for. So when we find this time and time again, that this really, really important gap, and that there is far more truth to be gained and far more actionable data to then go and build campaigns with when you look at that kind of data. And so go to the source of truth is the only way I can see an answer to that question.
Thanks. I'll come to you, Anantha. Something very beautiful you mentioned about engaging people and also getting them at the right age. And also Clark mentioned something like one of the trends, if you recall, he mentioned about people looking for love. And when I was going through some of these interrogation reports, many of them, the first point of contact was somebody posing as a woman. And then while they were getting radicalized, they also went up to those women and offered to marry them. And that is something that consistently comes out from many of these interrogation reports. The Indian government also did a very smart thing. The Indian government, right at the beginning, decided not to arrest many of these people, but instead try and engage them through the community and their peers, etc. So something similar to what you were talking about, that engage and empathize and try to understand them rather than throw them into a system which is already brutalized. So in a situation like this, if you were to look at this, you already have people who are basically looking for some kind of triggers, which could be loneliness, which could be alienation, a certain kind of polarization. How would you then approach this in the dialogues that you were to frame?
Let me try to answer that by something was mentioned. It's really an interesting problem that I think we have been facing on another particular issue, which is drugs.
Which is drugs?
Yeah. So drugs are not legalized. Thank God in Canada now they're going to legalize marijuana. But when you look at the economics of drug legalization, it makes sense to legalize it, because then you have information and you don't drive it underground, which means you lose that information. And information is extremely useful, the way Moonshot's using it, to identify these vulnerable individuals. So if you block it, you've lost that information. You've driven it underground.
But isn't that what you've been hearing from the platforms, that the first instinct is to block it?
Yes. So you're going to make it worse, because you basically take away that information that companies like Moonshot are able to use. And he brings a very interesting dichotomy between what we call revealed preferences, and that's what they are doing, is to capture through proxies, rather than the other opposite is stated, which means survey questionnaires. We know how to fill survey questionnaires, the right thing to do. So you never really get to know the person, what their real inner thoughts are, where their weaknesses are, where their vulnerabilities are. But through other proxies, you try it. So you want to generate as much information as you can, rather than actually kill it. So my take would be to allow that flourishing, because my concern is with Facebook and Twitter is that you sort of say, okay, we're going to take this out because we feel that this is not the right content. So what gives that legitimacy? Because the internet, in its broadest sense, is a public good. It's not privatized. The content, yes, maybe. But the mechanism is a public good. So it brings up some interesting discussions that we need to have in terms of where's the legitimacy because it's Facebook, but they're using a public good. So you're kind of caught. It's an interesting question that I think still hasn't been grappled by institutionalists who work on institutions and how those a private good versus a public good.
Let me ask you another hypothetical question. And I'll also declare that any resemblance to any current situation is purely coincidental. So let's imagine we are in a country where there is a majority community and a minority community. And then you have some people in that majority community constantly blaming the minority community, saying you are this, you are jihadi, you are this, etc., etc. And the result of that is that most people end up doing what they have been accused of. You know, we've seen this in country after country. So the radicalization is not really happening in that minority community. That radicalization is actually happening in the majority community. And this could be for a number of reasons, including political gain, where some political parties think that by polarizing the debate, it will be easier to make political gains. What do you do in a situation like this?
Censor the government? No, I'm just joking.
I wish.
Well, that's an interesting question. But you see, if you want, the chances of censoring or the majority is going to be difficult because in most of our democracies, it's still majority rule. The voting system, it's a democracy which has a constitution, but the actual selection is it's a majority voting process.
Correct.
So, in a way, I still think that you should allow that message to be, it's going to be allowed because it's very difficult to take a majority statement like if Facebook wants to say this is not allowed, you might get a backlash because that's the majority. I don't really have an answer to that other than sort of saying you just have to let it flourish, hoping that the majority will, in the process, start to understand a little bit more. You have, I suggest not having a counter narrative by the minority, but in fact, okay, let me rephrase. So today we have a group of young people from Myanmar, and we are talking about how they can make their positions through a research-driven approach. So what we are trying to inculcate, what kind of competencies is to sort of do it from a very systematic study. And they are the minority. So it's to look at the Constitution. The Constitution basically says it very clearly what exactly their rights are and how it's been violated. So the Constitution doesn't support what the majority is doing. So have a deconstruction of what that main, and it can be a counter-narrative as well through a deconstruction. So I'm not just totally against counter-narratives. It's about a counter-narrative by deconstructing the positions that are taken by the majority based on something that the majority hold very dear, which is, in this case, the Constitution, which they use for their purpose. So you kind of alert them.
Emphasize.
And you take and you kind of cut and paste and say, hey, you go to this clause whatever, in the Constitution, which you hold very dear, says X, Y, and Z. That's, I think, the best you can do.
My last question before we open it up to the audience for questions to both the ladies from the social media platforms. Today we are seeing a new kind of debates in India. For example, privacy is emerging as a major debate, especially after the last Supreme Court judgment where a 9-judge bench came up with, where privacy is now deemed as a fundamental right. So you have some of these basic values which a lot of these social media platforms are grappling with, like privacy, how much of data to take, not take, etc. Which also brings into question that you also have to want to keep it safe. So many times you might find extremist data which you may want to throw at the government or people who specifically deal with this. So as platforms, how do you arrive at these balances where these basic values like privacy, etc., are taken care of, but at the same time, you also have to ensure that if there is any information, which may be in the realm of surveillance, you have to alert the government or work with the government to therefore. So these are very contradictory, and there are no easy answers. So if you could give a direction to the audience on how you would like to tackle some of these contradictory issues, because both contribute or at the same time engage with extremist ideologies.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I think it's an extremely tough one also because it's very difficult to maintain that fine balance. But as far as possible, I think we are thinking about privacy by design in the first place. So even if you are developing any product, and I think this applies generally to technology, as much as possible, a lot of people are talking about privacy by design in order to protect the average user. But in this particular forum where we're talking about extremists and terrorists, obviously you need to have slightly different standards because you want to ensure that no real-world harm is caused. We have a specialized team that sits within Facebook that looks at trust and safety and that works with law enforcement agencies. And this is not only in the case of terrorists and extremists, but there are a lot of cases where, say, a child has gone missing or where there is some sort of sexual abuse. In these cases, you definitely want to make sure that those precious hours or those precious days are not lost because you're holding back and not approaching a law enforcement agency. But the bottom line in that as well is not only that is it going to cause real-world harm, but are you following all the laws and the regulations that are in place? So that's how we'd maintain that balance.
You want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've answered the question. You know, from a Twitter perspective, of course, we're a very different platform than some of the others. So in general, it's an open platform, and we take minimal information from our users. We don't really have a big data set. So in terms of just design, I think that we have interesting design, and we've not run into as many problems. And of course, the GDPR is something that we are aligning ourselves to. And what's really interesting now is that, you know, all companies internally, any projects that they're thinking of doing, they actually have internal committees that will weigh against the GDPR. And so it's actually increasing that accountability within companies, and it's probably a good trend to have. But you know, talking about privacy, yes, it doesn't mean that illegal activities are allowed on the platform, and I think that's where we can draw the line. So if there is you know, child sexual exploitation, which is clearly against the law, or there is, you know, promotion of terrorism, which is against the law in terms of, you know, that particular type of content, that is things that we can then work with law enforcement under the, you know, valid legal process that is laid out for us, and that's what we do. There are obviously countries which try and overreach. And so we have a lot of issues when it comes to, say, countries like Russia and Turkey and some other countries where perhaps the government wants to censor a lot more than what we would be comfortable with. And our company then will challenge those orders as well. Because ultimately, I mean, going back to the original point that I made, you know, and sort of related to the question that you asked, if you've got a dominant narrative, right? Traditionally, that dominant narrative came from media that was one way. And that dominant narrative could not be questioned, and people just sort of accepted it. Now, if you look at what's happening with social media, there may still be a dominant narrative because somebody's better at it than you are currently, but the fact is that there are voices stemming up from the ground, and those people are finding each other, and they're finding a way to counter any kind of narrative, whether it's dominant or not. And I'll just give you one or two examples. You know, in Brussels, there was a terror attack, and there was a hashtag that became really popular, and it was called Stop Islam. And that was a hashtag which was basically sort of anti a particular community. And people were flagging it, you know, even internally to Twitter saying, oh my God, this hashtag is happening. And as we looked at the hashtag, you know what happened? It actually turned into a hashtag which was not to stop Islam, but actually became like a hashtag pro the community, saying this is absolutely ridiculous. And the tone and the tenor of that hashtag actually became like a counter narrative. So sometimes when you give people that space to run the conversation through its course, you find that people actually arrive to a different conclusion than what they went in because they are actually accessing different opinions. So it's not a perfect, and you don't always get the results that you want, but I do think that open platforms like ours, which, you know, we've called previously the global town square, but I think it really is a really apt description of a platform where you have global users. I put out content from India, you can like it in America, he can retweet it in Africa, and it can go to Europe. You know, it's truly global, and that's where these conversations flow, and there is impact, and there are exchange of views. So to answer that question that you previously asked.
So we have 10 minutes, so any questions, please direct them at somebody who you would like to answer. Any? Yes, please.
Yes, I'm Christina Shori from the Geneva Center for Security Policy. If you look at the problem of right-wing extremism and Salafi jihadism, you see more and more that they have a story. And they're very good at storytelling. And they're basically promising a new world, a pure world, a caliphate. And even though we are now killing the singers, the song is still very much alive. So I just wondered, what is our story and what are we telling them?
Who would you like to answer?
Anyone.
Anybody who wants to take that? Clark, would you want to take that question? Sorry?
I'm still thinking.
I'll give a quick answer. And this is not a Twitter opinion. This is actually based on meetings that I've had with different people, where someone who did not want to be named and he doesn't want to come out, and he doesn't want to be categorized as sort of doing counter-narrative or de-radicalization, was basically essentially saying that the work that I do is I take stories from the Quran and I call myself a storyteller, and by simply retelling stories that actually have a very positive, narrative in them, I'm able to go into now, mosques. I'm being invited into madrasas. I'm being invited to prisons, where convicts are there. And he's like, and it's really stressful to have the conversation sometimes the first time because people just counter it with what they've heard, but over time they can't challenge it because it actually is from the Quran. So it's interesting, but I think at the heart of it is storytelling. And so some of the people that I meet, when they tell us how they use, whether it's offline conversations or whether they're using even any of our platforms to tell these stories, but it really comes down to countering that story with a story versus this is what you should do and this is what you shouldn't do, because I think people switch off when you're told what to think.
So one of the ideas that had come up in Digital Masala Challenge, and they won that round, was where they decided that they were going to champion stories from the ground. So they were going to have superheroes or superheroines who will come out and talk about their daily lives and talk about how they struggled and break the stereotypes that a person might have. So say someone from Kashmir and what they think about that person, say someone from another part of the country and from another part of the world. Just take those stories and break the stereotypes that people have in their minds about what might be going on. That is one way to tell that story. Now, this is external, and we don't work with the organization, ICSVE, but they started a counter-narratives campaign recently, which I think is quite brilliant. It's called Breaking the ISIS Brand, counter-narratives, where they've packaged videos that are very, very similar to a lot of ISIS videos. They're dark, and they have this eerie background music and all of that, except the story doesn't end with, please join us, this is great. It ends with, it was absolutely awful to be in the ISIS. And I think that's another way to tell the story. I mean, there are many ways to do it. I don't know if there's any one correct answer or there's any one way to do it.
I think also there's a danger of looking for the perfect story. We're not going to find it. Instead, there is a huge opportunity afforded to us by the unimaginable level amount of content on the internet. I think the statistic is old, so it's more than this, but it used to be the case that for every second that goes by, an hour of content is uploaded to YouTube. It stands to reason that some of that, a lot of it's rubbish, but some of it has to be effective counter-narrative content. And in that sense, because there is so much of it, it's one of the best ways to counter the fact that there are multi-threaded narratives just from ISIS alone. They'll deliver different narratives to different people in different parts of the world. They know that there isn't one story. So I'm not sure that we should attempt to counter it with one story, and instead, go with the logic of the internet, go with the incredible amount of content, and find within it those credible stories that probably weren't even designed to be counter-narrative, but it might just be a really compelling interview with a survivor on a news channel, but that actually goes right to the heart of the issue. And its credibility is that much greater because it's so obviously not thought through and designed to counter a narrative.
I could add to what Clark just said. There's a friend of mine. He's heading the counter-terror organization of his state, one of the largest states in India. And he's a hardcore intelligence man as well. He spent most of his career in the intelligence organizations. So when he went back to the state, he first looked for triggers which lead to, and he tried to simplify them as much as possible. For example, feelings of loneliness adds to this. So how do I address? Or feelings of not being heard adequately by the system, and therefore a feeling of alienation. And then he took some money from the government, and he created a lot of religious leaders from a particular community. He armed them with counter-narratives. Or he said that you find your own counter-narratives, build them into stories which were credible, which you can then base in the holy book and find answers there. And he just across the state started creating these centers of dialogue where these young men or young women would come in and start asking questions and their doubts and their angst. He wasn't looking for any particular answer, but he at least managed to create dialogues. And suddenly they started seeing just the fact that they're having a dialogue started dissipating the angst that many of them were feeling. So as Clark pointed out, or as the others have been pointing out, you don't really need a particular story, but just the fact that you're beginning to have a dialogue helps dissipate a lot of this angst. Any other questions? Yes, please.
So I hate to pour some cold water on this lovely conversation about how it seems, if I were listening to all of you, that we're doing a super job online, stopping kids from joining groups like AQ or ISIS. So I'm going to bring some reality in here, and I'd really like Facebook and Twitter to respond. It's a really sobering moment we are in 2018, where organizations of all kinds use memes as part of their warfare strategy. And you have governments all over the world trying to figure out how to deal with this, and not just your organizations, but other companies, for-profit companies. You talked about the public good, sir. These companies make a gigantic profit in what they're doing. So here's my question. If I were to just listen to what you both said about all these great things that Facebook and Twitter are doing, and you are doing some good things, and thank God you have begun to move in a direction where you're investing in communities at the grassroots and listening to their ideas and helping them scale. But my question really is about global scale. Facebook is the fourth largest country in the world, and you're talking about 200 people on a platform that has billions of people that use it that are dealing with one kind of extremism. So I want you to take off the I'm working at Twitter and I'm working at Facebook hat and just help me to understand what it is going to take for-profit companies to take responsibility over the role that they play in our society in 2018, and how far you think a company would be willing to go to be able to scale up so that we are seeing not just one-offs on a great campaign, and I agree with you, those were really great examples that you both gave. And Facebook is doing tremendous work in Europe and tremendous work in this part of the world too in trying to identify NGOs that can help them do their work. But the scale is so tiny that I will say to you, if I were in government still, it's a one-off. Give me a break. I need a sustained 24/7 machine for years that is going to influence young kids. So what's the answer on scale? What's the answer on commitment? And how do we take you seriously if you can't give us the answers that we know exist in the world today for the situation we're in?
Thank you. I'd begin by saying that, first of all, I just want to clarify, when I said we have 200 plus specialists, I'm talking only about people who are working on the issue of counterterrorism and not on all issues generally that's on the platform. But how we'd scale, I think we are heading in that direction. Over the past couple of months, a lot of you would have heard about how we're going from 10,000 people who are reviewing content and ensuring that a lot of this dangerous content is taken down. We are going to double that and go up to 20,000. And we are working towards it, but it can't happen overnight. Which is why we're not only talking about what enforcement we have on the platform, that is, these are the tools that we have, this is the kind of technology that we're using, we have hash-hiding databases, we're not stopping only there. A part of that scaling is to say that we are doing proactive programs. You want to get on the other side as well, but all I'd say is that we'd need a little bit more time. We can't scale from, say, 100 or 200 to 5,000 overnight, and we're getting there, but we're getting there in little bits and pieces, and as we figure out the problem, which is why I'd go back to my earlier point, that we have to do the research when we run these programs as well. We can't blindly do these programs and hope that they're landing well. Once we run these pilots, we know that this is what works, that this is the kind of counter-narratives in the case of extremism and terrorism. These are the kind of counter-narratives will be effective on the ground. We do that sort of research and then we move ahead, instead of just scaling it up blindly.
Yeah, I think my answer might be a little similar, but you know, if you look at the last 3 years, I would argue that there is some amount of scale that has been achieved, although the work is not over, of course, and more work needs to be done. And I think the fact that, you know, it is no longer the platform for this kind of recruiting and propaganda by this organization, the fact that work has been done to take that off is actually indicative of the work that we are doing. And those systems are now in place to be able to continuously and constantly take off some of these accounts, actually the majority of these accounts, many of them before they actually even put their first tweet in, realizing the success and that these problems are transferred over to some of the smaller companies, coming up with coalitions and making sure that we're doing capacity building with the smaller companies. At the same time, acknowledging that this is something that a company cannot do alone, and that there are many civil society actors, many governments, people who are actually experts in these areas and they're working in these areas, but perhaps they don't know how to use social media as well as they should, but you know, they want to, and we actually work with them and we do trainings with them and we try and basically capacity build them, is part of a holistic plan. And of course, you know, you solve one problem and another problem comes up. I mean, I don't know if people are aware, but in the last 18 months, Twitter basically made abuse, I mean, overall abuse, I'm not just talking about sort of terrorism, as a company priority, a priority that went up straight to the CEO, to Jack Dorsey, where, you know, over 30 product and policy changes have been implemented in the company. So really, if you look at it, like if you step back and look at the work that we're doing, it is very much designed to respond to some of these problems. But yeah, it does take time to be able to respond to them, you know, and trends move forward. And so when you finish one problem, something else comes up in society and we have to kind of cater to that issue as well. So it's always a work in progress.
So we're completely out of time. I'll just take this opportunity to thank Samir, Maya, Sushant, and Kabir. They've done a lot of great work on some of these ideologies, so you should follow up and read up on this. And thank you so much. What an excellent panel. It's a privilege having all of you there. And thank you, everybody in the audience, for being there. Thank you.